Hello everyone, my name is Abhishek and welcome back to my channel. So today is day 39 of our complete DevOps course, and in this class we'll be talking about Kubernetes RBAC. So as I promised you, and also you people might have seen in the thumbnail, that I am going to show you how to create a 30 days free OpenShift cluster. Okay, so this cluster is going to be free for 30 days, and you can like create resources in this OpenShift cluster, and you can play around with this OpenShift cluster. But let's talk into the details of it at the end of the video. And currently, let's focus on Kubernetes RBAC. So what is Kubernetes RBAC and why is it important? So I will say that Kubernetes RBAC is a very simple but complicated topic. So what is simple? And again, when I say it is simple, why is it complicated? So Kubernetes RBAC is a very simple topic to understand, but if it is not implemented right, then it becomes very complicated to debug the issues, or even it becomes very complicated for your organization, because Kubernetes RBAC is directly related to security. When something is related to security, that itself means that it is very important. So you need to understand the concept of RBAC more than understanding how to create a service account or how to create role and how to create role binding, because that takes very less time. Okay, so if you want to understand how to create a role, how to create a service account, and how to create a role binding, you can also get things done in 10 minutes. Like, you can create a pod, attach it service account, and understand the things. But I'm not going to talk about those things. Instead, I'm going to firstly explain you the concept of RBAC, how and why is it very important. And after that, I'm going to talk about, okay, what is service account, what is role, and what is role binding. Okay, perfect. So firstly, Kubernetes RBAC can be broadly divided into two parts. Okay, so the first part can be users, and the second thing can be your service account, or how services manage access in the Kubernetes. That can be any applications that you are running in Kubernetes. So firstly, let's try to understand this user management. Okay, so if you have a Kubernetes cluster, let's say you have been using Kubernetes in Minikube, or you're using Kubernetes in Kind, or any other Kubernetes platforms, let's say. So out of the box, you get administrative access to these clusters, right? Because they are your local Kubernetes clusters, and you have been playing around with this local Kubernetes clusters for learning Kubernetes. But when you try to use Kubernetes in organizations, the very first thing that you would do is, let's say this is your Kubernetes clusters. As DevOps engineers or Kubernetes administrators, your primary responsibility would be to define access. So if there is a development team, if there is a QE team, okay, so how do you define what access should developers have onto this cluster, and what access should this QE engineer should have on this cluster? Okay, it's not that any QE engineer can come to this Kubernetes cluster and delete resources in let's say kube system namespace, or let's say the QE engineer deletes something related to etcd. Okay, so these things can become very worse if, like, if someone comes and deletes something related to etcd, then it becomes very difficult for your administrator or for your DevOps team to get back the original state of these things. So effectively, how you can solve this problem is by defining RBAC. That means to say role based access control. Okay, so what is role based access control? Depending upon the role of the person. Okay, so RBAC, depending upon the role, you would define access. So role based access, and this is the control that what you are trying to do. Okay, so this is one part of it. So how you are going to manage the user management, or how you are going to manage the access to users in your Kubernetes cluster, that is one part of RBAC. And the second part is how you are going to deal with the service account. That means to say, let's say you have created a pod through deployment or through any other sources, you have created a pod. Now, what access does this pod need to have on the Kubernetes cluster? So should pod be having access to config maps? Should this pod have access to secrets? Okay, so let's say as part of your application, you want to read config map. As part of your application, you want to read secret. As part of your application, can you delete, like let's say you have you have deployed a pod, and what this pod is doing, let's say this pod is a malicious pod, and what this pod is doing is it is deleting some content related to API server. Okay, or accidentally it is removing some important files on your system. So how do you restrict this? So again, the same thing, similar to user management, you can also manage the access for your services or for your applications that are running on the cluster using the RBAC. Okay, so two primary responsibilities of RBAC is user management as well as managing the access of the services that are running on the cluster. Now, how this is done on a broad level, okay, before I jump into the depth of how do you manage all of these things, on a broad level in Kubernetes, you have three major things, okay, for managing the RBACs. One is, like I told you, service accounts or users. Second thing is called as Kubernetes roles or cluster roles. Third is role binding or cluster role binding. So I'll try to explain the difference of roles and cluster role binding and cluster role binding as well. Don't worry about it. But first of all, these are the high level three things that can define RBAC in Kubernetes. Okay, but how do you create users in Kubernetes? Okay, so if we go back to the previous slide, here I told you there are two essential things. One is users and one is service accounts. Okay, but how do you create users? Like for example, if you are using Minikube, okay, all these days you might be using Minikube. Okay, so if you go inside the Minikube, can you create a user? Like on my personal laptop, I can use, it's a Linux, let's say it's a Linux laptop, I can use something like user add. Okay, and using user add, I can create a user on my Linux system, and I can share this access, like with relevant, I can say that I'll create a user called developer, and someone who has this username and password, they can log into this Linux box and they can do specific set of actions on this Linux box. But how do you do this on Kubernetes? So in Kubernetes also, can you use this command to create users? No, you can't. Okay, so what Kubernetes says is Kubernetes does not deal with user management, whereas Kubernetes offloads the user management to identity providers. So this is very important to understand, because service accounts is something that you can create. Okay, so anyone can simply log into a Kubernetes cluster. Even on your Minikube cluster, you can log in and you can create a service account. But this part is very important to understand, because when you are going to work in an organization, let's say your organization is using EKS, your organization is using AKS or OpenShift. So how do you create these users? How can you say that, okay, DevOps engineer should log in with this specific user? Or in DevOps team, let's say you have 10 users, so probably you might create 10 users for this DevOps users, and probably there are 10 developers, so you might want to create 10 accounts or 10 users for this developers, and each of them should have only relevant access. So developer should not be able to delete resources. QE people should at the most only read the resources and read the logs, probably, just as an example. Okay, and DevOps engineers might want to do the administration of the cluster. So how do you do all of these things? So that's what Kubernetes says is, okay, I'm not going to manage the users. I will offload the user management to identity providers. So I'll give you a very simple example. So these days, let's say you're using any applications. Okay, the fundamental thing that you might have noticed is most of these applications have options like login with Instagram, or very popular one is login with Google. And what happens is, you don't even have to create account with these applications. Let's say there is a person who has downloaded an application from Play Store, and most of the times you get this option called login with Google, login with Instagram, or login with Facebook. And what happens is this person gets access to this app without creating the user, right? So this is what exactly Kubernetes also does. So Kubernetes says is, I will offload the user management. Okay, so in Kubernetes, you all know that there is a component called API server. So you can pass certain flags to the API server. Okay, I'm going to show you what that flags are. It's not a rocket science. Don't worry about that flags, because always I tell you, don't worry about syntaxes, or don't worry about how does a YAML look like. Always understand the concept. So in Kubernetes, the API server works as your OAuth server. Okay, now what is this OAuth? Wait for it. Okay, so you can offload the user management to any identity providers. What are some of popular identity providers? For example, you are using this Kubernetes cluster on AWS, and let's say this is your EKS Kubernetes cluster. So why can't you use IAM users? That's what Kubernetes says. Okay, so if you are using EKS platform, what Kubernetes says is you can use your IAM users, and using your IAM users, okay, you can log into Kubernetes. So in between, what you need to do is you have to create something called as IAM provider or IAM OAuth provider. Okay, and using this IAM, the persons will log into the Kubernetes cluster, and already you have created users and groups in IAM, right? So if you have a user, and if you have if your user belongs to a group, so as you log into the Kubernetes, so you get to log in with the same username, and you get to log in with the same group. Okay, so this is how Kubernetes offloads the user management to external identity providers. Okay, this concept is same whether it is OpenShift, whether it is EKS, whether it is AKS. So depending upon the identity provider that your organization is using, this might change. For example, your organization might be using LDAP, your organization might be using Okta, your organization might be using any SSO. So you can use all of these things. Kubernetes natively supports all of these things. Okay, but it is up to you how you want to configure this identity provider, how you want to create users inside this identity providers. You can also use some identity brokers like Keycloak. So Keycloak is a very popular one. Many people manage their Kubernetes identity management or user management using Keycloak as a broker. You can connect to all of these things. Okay, so even if you want to try some things, like let's say you have a access to production, or you can create a Kubernetes cluster on Amazon. Let's say today you can go to EKS and you can integrate EKS with Keycloak, and using Keycloak you can connect it with your GitHub. So in your GitHub, you can create user management, right? As part of GitHub, you can collaborate with hundreds of people, and you can create collaborators. You can create users in your organization, which user has what access in your GitHub. So using Keycloak, you can connect to EKS, and you can get the all of these users. Okay, this is how Kubernetes offloads the user management. And the second part is service accounts, right? So service accounts, it's just like a YAML file everybody can create. Okay, so there is no different with respect to service account. So if you understood how to create users, and I will show you how to create service accounts. So service accounts is just like creating a pod. Okay, don't worry about it. There is simply like like you have your pod.yaml, you can create a service account.yaml, sa.yaml, for example. And inside the service account.yaml, you will just define as part of your YAML file, what should be your API version, what should be your kind, what should be the name of your service account. But then comes the interesting part. Okay, what will happen next? Let's say you logged in as a user, or your application is currently running as a service account. By default, even if you are creating a pod, you might have this question, like all these days I'm using some pod. Okay, by default, whenever you are running a pod, it comes with a default service account. Even if you are creating a service account or not, a service account gets created automatically. And using this service account itself, Kubernetes pod, whatever applications that you are running, it will be talking to the API server for any, or to that matter of fact, for connecting with any resources in Kubernetes, it will use this service accounts itself. If you are not creating service account, Kubernetes will create a default. There is a default service account. Kubernetes will attach the default service account to your pod. If you are creating a service account, then you can use your custom service account. But what happens after that? Whether you are logged in into your Kubernetes cluster as a user, or whether your application is running on a Kubernetes cluster as a service account, that is fine. Okay. After that, how do you manage the rules, or how do you manage the configuration? So to define access after this part, Kubernetes supports two important resources, that is called role and role binding. So you can also consider this as cluster role when it has cluster level permissions, and you can consider it as cluster role binding when it has cluster level permissions. So this is not important at this point of time. Simply understand that Kubernetes does all of these things using role and role binding. Okay, now what is this role and role binding? So once you create your once your application is running as a service account or you logged in as a user, the next part is how to grant access to it. So firstly, you will create a role. Okay, let's say you are creating a role which says, and you want to assign this role to the developers. So what you are saying is they should have access to pods, they should have access to config maps, they should have access to secrets within the same namespace. Okay, to have within a single namespace, you will create a role. If they want to have access across the cluster, then you will create cluster role. That's the only difference, but we will talk in detail as well. Okay, so you have created this role. Now you have to attach this role to the users, right? So to attach, you will use role binding. That's the very simple concept. Okay, what is a role? So a role is a YAML file where you will write all the things, like, they need to have access to config map, they need to have access to secret, they need to have even if it is a single user, you will create a role and you will say, okay, so whoever gets this role attached to them, like let's say there is a user called Abhishek. If you're attaching this role to the Abhishek, then Abhishek will get all these permissions. If you're attaching this role to XYZ person, so XYZ person will get access to all of these resources that you have defined in the role.yaml. So you can consider, or you can compare it with IAM policies. Okay. So once you attach all of these things, or once you say that anybody who gets access to this role might have access to all of these things, but how do you actually assign them this? Okay, so you have created a role and there is a user. How this user and how this service account and the role gets attached to each other? Okay, so to do this, you use something called as role binding. Okay, so the simple ecosystem will look like this. Service account, consider it as user as well. Role and role binding. Okay, actually, sorry, this arrow. So this is service account, this is role, and this is role binding. So you will create a service account or a user. Okay, and you will create a role. Using this role binding, you will bind both of them together. Okay, so this is a very simple architecture. So if you don't have a role binding, you will create a service, you will create a role, but both of them are not attached together. Okay, so if you have just a role binding, you will create a service account, but to bind you need a role. Without having a role, just having a role binding, you are not binding your service account with any permissions. So simply this will take care of permissions, this will be taking care of users, creating user management, and this will take care of binding the permissions to users. Okay, binding permissions to user. So this is the concept of Kubernetes RBAC. So simply, if you are creating a role within a specific namespace, it will be called as role. And if you are creating this role in the scope of the cluster, it is called as a cluster role. Similarly, role binding as well. Now, what is the difference between cluster role and cluster role binding? I don't think it is good to discuss in this specific class, because if there are any beginners who is trying to understand this concept, it will go over their head. So whenever we are doing the practicals, it will be very easy to understand the difference between cluster role binding, role and role binding as well. Okay. So till here, this is the theory part of your Kubernetes RBAC. If you haven't understood any specific topic here, you can put that in the comment section, and I'll try to do more detailed video on that, or we will try to do a masterclass or something. But till now, we only discussed about the theory part of Kubernetes RBAC. Now, as I promised you, let me show you how to create a OpenShift cluster, a free OpenShift, free trial OpenShift cluster for 30 days. Okay, so you can make use of this OpenShift cluster for your learning. So let me stop sharing here, and let me start sharing the other screen. Share. Perfect. Got it. Right. So I hope you people are seeing my Firefox screen, right? So I opened a incognito window and just search for OpenShift Sandbox. Okay, so OpenShift Sandbox, once you open this one, you will notice that, you know, you will get a free trial. What does it say here? Get 30 days free access. Okay, let me increase the font. Get 30 days free access to shared OpenShift and Kubernetes cluster. I already told you it's a shared cluster because this is just for your practice and to understand the concept of RBAC. So click on start your sandbox for free. All that you need to do is you need to create an account with Red Hat. Okay, so register a Red Hat account, or you can also like, if you have already a Red Hat account, you can make use of the Red Hat account. Okay, so in my case, I already have a Red Hat account. So if you don't have, you can just create Red Hat account. It's just following steps, and once you follow the steps, you can create a Red Hat account. Okay, so let me just stop sharing here so that I can enter the details. Stop share, and I'm trying to enter my Red Hat account details. So this is very simple, like, you create your AWS account, right? Similarly, you can also create a Red Hat account. Okay, now I'm just creating a Red Hat account. Sorry, I'm just entering the details of my Red Hat account, and this is public. Anyone can create a free account here in the OpenShift sandbox. Done. Okay, now I am logging in, and let me share back my screen. Perfect. So now I'm logged in. So the only difference is you will see the same screen, but now, if you see this icon here that says that I am logged in. Now again, click on start using sandbox. What you will get is a shared OpenShift cluster for 30 days in no time. Okay. So the OpenShift cluster is assigned to you, and this cluster has, both developer and administrative tabs. But in the administrative tab, you only have limited access. Like, click on login with dev sandbox. Like I told you, like, this is the identity provider that OpenShift is using. In your case, this can be in your organization, this can be login with LDAP, login with Okta. Okay, so you have created a Red Hat account, right? So this Red Hat account that you have created get saved in this dev sandbox. Okay, so they are using this as the identity provider to define, okay, what kind of user is he? Is he a paid user? Is he a subscription user? Is he a Red Hat user? Okay, you get all of this information. You send all of this information to the OpenShift cluster using this identity provider. Okay, now as soon as I click on dev sandbox, okay, it will try to get the information of my specific user, like what kind of user is this person. I just created a Red Hat account and provided all the details, right? Depending upon that, it gave me a Red Hat OpenShift cluster. And this is how your production environments looks like. Okay, all this time you might have used just Kubernetes clusters, but here, see what happens is this is my OpenShift cluster that is dedicated for me for 30 days, and it's a shared cluster. For example, here, what I can do is I can go to the workloads and I can look into the pods. I can look into the deployments, and here I can switch through the namespaces. But because this is a shared cluster, I'm only given access to this specific namespace that is created for me. Okay, so what this entire concept here is, using OpenShift dedicated, you will get a shared cluster, and each person gets a namespace. Now click on the icon here on the username, and you get an option called copy login command. Click on that, and again it will prompt you for login. Once you log in, click on the display token, and using this token you can log in through the CLI. So here what I will do is I will open my terminal. This is my terminal, and just provide this same display token that you got from the URL, and now you are able to log in to the OpenShift cluster from your terminal. Now you can do all of the things like, kubectl get pods. What happens is, you will be able to see what are the pods that are running in that specific namespace. You only have access to that namespace. Okay, so because sometimes, this cluster might take time in responding back, but it is hardly less than seconds. Let me create a deployment here. Kubectl create deployment nginx hyphen image. Okay, now what happens is a nginx deployment will be created for me. Let us see if it got created or not. Now, if I click on the deployments tab here, through the UI also I can monitor, right? So using the deployment tabs, now you will notice that, Nginx deployment is created for me. Okay, so this is the Nginx deployment. And here, using the UI itself, you can scale down the pods, you can scale up the pods. Now I scaled up the pods to 2. So this way you can play around and you can get the real feel of Kubernetes cluster, how Kubernetes clusters are used within the organization. In the routes, you can create ingress. People have been asking me about ingress, right? So you can play around with ingress here. You can create services here, right? You can also use storage services like persistent volumes. How do they work? All of these things. So using this real time production environment, you can understand not just the concept of RBAC, but you can also play around with these clusters and you can explore a lot of things, how events are omitted. So these are the events. Okay, so what is happening within the Kubernetes cluster? So Nginx pod got created, Nginx pod got started, so Kubernetes is trying to pull the image. Okay, and you can search for the events, API explorer, lot of the things what people usually do, what DevOps engineers usually do within the organization. You can get a feel of it. And within the user management, like I told you, you can create service accounts, you can create roles, we can create role bindings, which we will do in the next class. Okay, in the tomorrow's class we will use the same account and we will create service account, we will create roles, and we'll create role bindings as well. Okay, so stay tuned for tomorrow's video. And before tomorrow's video, try to create this account, because as you get more and more production or real-time experience, you'll be more confident and you will face the interviews very well. I hope you enjoyed today's video. And if you have any questions, please put that in the comment section, and don't forget to subscribe my channel, Abhishek Veeramalla. Thank you so much. See you all in the next video. Take care.